SBC Media.
Welcome to iGaming Daily, analysing the news from the betting and gaming industry all over the globe. Supported by SBC Summit Latino America, bringing together the leadership teams and product specialists from retail and online operators in Latin American markets.
Discover the potential of Latin America's booming iGaming and sports betting markets at SBC Summit Latin America, the premier industry event in the region. Join SBC at the Seminole Hard Rock Hotel and Casino in Miami from October 31st to November the 2nd. Register now at sbcevents.com.
Good afternoon and welcome to the iGaming Daily. We have arrived at the business end of the Rugby World Cup in France, and after a dramatic weekend of action, interest in the tournament has really reached fever pitch. I'm joined by SBC's John Cook and Martyn Elliott, who are both avid rugby fans and are set to provide insight on the tournament and whether betting operators are taking advantage of what's been a dramatic event so far. Before we get into that though, last week, Martyn, you and I discussed the Misfits boxing event from the weekend and how betting operators can take advantage of that. Yeah, I wanted to get your take on the event. We saw a lot of betting brand in there, but the event was underwhelming, shall we say?
Well, I didn't watch it because I was watching Ireland against New Zealand in the rugby, and I imagine there was a lot more physical contact and a lot more pain and athleticism in that game than there was in the boxing from the clips I've seen. I've only seen the highlights, and you're stretching it to call it highlights of Misfits boxing. It just looks so low quality. I don't think any sort of social media obsessed teenager who was watching that will be converted into a boxing fan, put it that way.
Yeah, no, I don't think there's going to be any attraction to betting on that type of content either, because it just wasn't great. It wasn't good sports, but yeah, no, let's see. The production was great anyway. But as you mentioned, the rugby from the weekend, John, how did you find this weekend's fixtures? A real, some incredible drama, really what the World Cup is all about, right?
So realistically, putting it out there, I think it was possibly the best weekend of rugby ever to have happened. It was absolutely astounding. And some of the contact that was made in some of those games was, you could feel the pain that the players were going through. I think the most interesting thing was we were expecting all of the favourites to get through relatively easy by either sort of 5 to 10 points. And certainly with Argentina, you expected them to get absolutely battered. I was a little bit nervous about England because they were narrow favourites, but having seen them play Fiji in the warm-up game at Twickenham, I thought the sevens game that Fiji played and have turned into a 15s game was a little bit too intimidating for us to be able to deal with.
Okay, that is interesting. And I guess building on that point, some of the heavy impacts that you mentioned, the very physical games from this weekend, who is that going to affect worse, in your opinion, as we move into the semi-finals now? Who's really going to sort of feel the effects of a hard-fought quarter-final tie?
You've got to think about it. We're now at the business end, so a lot of players have gone through a lot of games and taken a lot of contact. I think it's something, don't quote me on this, but I think it's something like the average player goes through at least 4 car crashes in a game at the professional level, which is astronomical impact on the body. The South Africa game, that was massively physical, and that may potentially benefit England to a certain extent. Smith's injury from the Fiji game where he was caught in the face, that is potentially an impact for England. So that, I think, is going to be an interesting match. There is the potential for it to be a very close game like the last World Cup final. I think South Africa potentially are just going to do what they do really well, which is physical pack, pushing through, using the bomb squad to come in and playing from there. So I think that will be interesting. But the impacts that they took will potentially have a bit of a weakening towards their side. I think New Zealand are potentially the favourites now. The game that they've played throughout the tournament has been fascinating. It's changed a lot, apart from their loss to France. It's been a pretty intense development stage for them. So I think we're probably going to see a New Zealand-South Africa final. It's going to be less close in Argentina and New Zealand because I think Argentina are just a complete surprise to be anywhere near the semis.
Yeah, a really nice oversight of the sort of the tournament so far and how we've ended up with the final four that we have. Martyn, we have some big absentees, as John mentioned, from that final four. I think a lot of people would have expected the host to be there. Would have also expected Ireland to be there. Is that good news for European bookmakers? But obviously we've still got that England wild card in there. We know a lot of patriotic punters in England, but yeah, will that be good news for betting operators that some of the dark horses have made it so far and some of the favourites have dropped out?
Well, I'm sure Paddy Power, their employees wouldn't have been celebrating that result, the Ireland defeat, but from a financial perspective, because they'd pushed Ireland a lot in terms of offers and so on the site, and Ireland being the world number one for the last 18 months or so, I think. We'd have expected Ireland to go a bit further, and they certainly started that quarter-final game against New Zealand as favourites. So there'll be some wins there, but I don't imagine that any British bookmaker has taken much money on England to win the tournament, because if you watch them in the warm-ups, you'd have thought, taking a pile of £10 notes into the back garden and setting fire to it was a better investment than betting on Steve Borthwick's team to win. But here we are in the semi-final. They've scrapped their way through. And I guess if they can somehow get past South Africa, and I don't really see a route to it, there'll be plenty of money for them in the week of the final, just the patriotic punter. But I would imagine the bookies are generally taking money on South Africa and New Zealand to win the tournament. And just having a look at the odds at the minute, I mean, South Africa are about 6-1 on, generally available to win the semi-final against England, and they are odds on to win the tournament now as well. Whereas England are 14-1 to win the tournament. And if for some reason you see England's pack suddenly being able to compete with South Africa's pack on Saturday, 5-1 to beat South Africa. But I would strongly suggest that you're better keeping your money in your pocket than back in England for that game. So
yeah, no, that's it's really interesting, and obviously the tournament being in France, we've had some really engaging games so far. We've got the good start times, which is something that always makes a massive difference for engagement at major tournaments. Do you think we've seen bookmakers take advantage of the Rugby World Cup, or do you think they could be doing more? And do you think they'll be doing more now we've had a good run for England?
We might see some more. I think it's been a bit of a missed opportunity so far. Not many of them have done too much around it. There's I mentioned Paddy Power already. They've been building up Ireland on site and social media and so on. Hills have done some TV advertising, but it's still very much been secondary to football on most of the sites. And I think some of the bookmakers will look back on it when they see the size of the TV audiences. 4 million plus for each of those evening games at the weekend, which is more than a quarter of the UK TV audience on a Sunday night. So there were opportunities there for them to make some money on this, but I don't think they really bought into it, which is a shame.
Yeah.
A missed opportunity, I think.
Are you surprised by that as well, John?
I was just about to chime in, actually, and just say I think it's one of those things around the state of play of rugby in general. COVID certainly impacted rugby within the UK, France, home nations, and also down into the Southern Hemisphere as well. And there has been a huge drop-off of players at grassroots. So I think rugby has become a bit of a casual sport viewer, as opposed to, as it used to be, a real marquee time for rugby in general. The viewing crowds that it has on on a weekly basis. So why is the Rugby World Cup going to be any different? But I think this World Cup in itself has really reinvigorated the interest of rugby in general. And you've got to also look from a bookmaker's perspective. There are other sports that are becoming more fashionable in terms of general viewers. So looking at F1 and the interest off the back of the Netflix series Drive to Survive. I mean, there is a massive influx of viewers within F1. The thing that bookmakers are trying to capitalize there is, where is the betting opportunity? I was talking to a number of people last week in terms of the sports that they're going to be offering within their sportsbook in terms of new opportunities when I was at an industry conference. F1 is one of the ones that people are talking about. And I did ask the question around, how's rugby doing for you? And it was just sort of a middle of the road sport. So I'm not sure whether the wider business community was seeing this as an opportunity before the World Cup, and they may be regretting it now, especially as the favourites haven't got through. So the bookmakers who have taken bets on have probably done pretty well out of it. They've certainly done well out of me. But I am going to be one of the foolish people that will be patriotic and bet for England to get into the World Cup final. I think it is also interesting based on the way that the tournament has gone as a whole. And then where there are huge shifts in the favourites. I mean, Martyn was talking about Ireland being at the top of the rankings for the last 18 months. They're now third. So the world rankings have changed quite dramatically through this tournament, and England have taken a jump from 8th to 5th. Scotland have gone from 5th to 6th, which really shows how well they've developed. Ireland and France are now at 3 and 4th, respectively, and then the Southern Hemisphere teams of South Africa and New Zealand are back at 1 and 2. So I think there is the movements in the world rankings may also affect the odds that are being offered. And if a bookmaker was smart right now, I'd be pushing England to win the World Cup and put some offers out for that, because Martyn was talking about England up front with South Africa. South Africa's forwards have changed so dramatically throughout the tournament, and they no longer have their complete bench of subs that they can bring the bomb squad on. It's kind of, they have 5 players rather than the full 6 as a front row option that realistically are in a position to make an impact on the game. So I actually think that the England forwards may win that competition because they have been very consistent throughout this World Cup. It's the backs, in my view, that have been slightly problematic.
Yeah, there's a couple of little follow-up points to that, John. There is a rugby fly-on-the-wall documentary coming out on Amazon Prime this week, I think, which focuses on the end of the Premiership season last year in England, which looks quite exciting. So that was a really thrilling finish to that season. And if we just look a little bit further afield, I know I mentioned the viewing figures in the UK have been very good. They've also been off the charts good across Europe. France has had higher viewing figures for some of their games than they did for the Football World Cup final, which France were in. And one outlier, not in the tournament, and I don't think even very close to qualifying, but the opening game of the tournament, France-New Zealand, had 3.5 million viewers in Germany.
That's not surprising to me. Germany is a developing rugby nation, and their union, their equivalent of the RFU, has put a lot of investment into rugby as a sport within the country. So that's quite an interesting one.
So maybe, for the German market, obviously a tricky one for sports betting. So, that might be a way to engage an audience there. And I did want to bring back to something you said about F1. It doesn't strike me as a very betting friendly sport. I might be wrong there. Obviously racing is, but yeah, it doesn't strike me as like there's going to be very many betting opportunities. Rugby, on the other hand, potentially is. It's high scores. It's the sort of breaks in the game. Are we seeing? We're constantly in football seeing innovation in markets and the amount of markets that are offered. You can bet on over offsides now and stuff like that. Are we seeing bookmakers innovate in terms of the markets they offer in rugby, or not so much?
It hasn't been quite as much as you would see in football or NFL or something like that. It tends to be very much still match odds and handicap odds and things like total points scored and so on. You're starting to see some player props coming in. Bookmakers, again, through this have been pushing their bet builder offer on some of the rugby games as well. I think that there is a lot more scope because it is quite a stats-based game. There are loads of stats available immediately after the game. So I think there are more opportunities within the player props, most tackles and yards run, defenders beaten, all that kind of thing opens itself up to those sort of player prop markets. In play is also an interesting one. It has been available on rugby for some time, and if you think about the twists and turns you saw in those games at the weekend, there should have been a lot of in-play action if there were sort of confirmed bettors watching. Interesting to see what more bookmakers can come up with, and obviously it's a bit more about the data suppliers as much as anything, isn't it?
Yeah, of course.
What they can come up with for those in-play offers.
Yeah, I echo your sentiment there about the bet builders. It's certainly very friendly to a bet builder offering, and it will be interesting to see if operators sort of build off the World Cup, even if they haven't tapped into it fully, and use it to continue boosting their rugby offering. But John, I wanted to give you the sort of final word here, because you mentioned that generally speaking, rugby is been struggling post-pandemic, not just for betting engagement, but generally speaking for grassroots rugby. How big do you think the World Cup can be? Because it's been so good, and obviously we've had a great England run. Hopefully won't come to an end at the weekend, but we've had a great England run nonetheless. How big can the World Cup be in terms of boosting a new era for rugby, if you like, in the UK and in Europe?
I think the real struggle is we, as a sport, have lost the development age group through that sort of 2.5 to almost 3 years of COVID, where rugby is so contact heavy. The regulations throughout COVID were very restrictive on the way in which we could train and the way in which we could engage people. And I think the game as a whole is working towards developing itself into different types of rugby. So we're seeing huge growth in walking rugby, certainly in England and certainly across the home nations, as I would call them. France has made some huge developments in terms of player data. So they have player data from all leagues, not just their main Premier Leagues. They've done it all the way down to almost grassroots in terms of GPS player data for fitness and selection purposes. So they're using technology and innovation within the game. And I think certainly the World Cup will start to build the imagination of some of the girls and boys out in the wider world, that will show that rugby is an interesting sport. But the World Cup, in terms of engagement from bringing players back, certainly the area that I'm in, there is a huge concern about health. Due to the demographic in the area from the end of COVID. So we've lost a generation of rugby players that could still be playing. And I think there is also the physical interaction is terrifying for some parents at the grassroots level. So innovation in types of sport, i.e. walking rugby, as we've spoken about, touch rugby, and potentially getting the international bodies to create World Cups for this sort of thing, will bring rugby to the forefront, and then potentially it may create opportunities for operators to capitalise. But just going back to Martyn's points in terms of what's being offered, the sportsbook that I use, the offers changed from what was available at the start of the World Cup to what was available in the semis. What was available in the quarters, sorry. So you were actually able to do some player-specific betting as well.
I know that is really interesting for sure. It shows, it potentially shows that the interest has increased, and that's led to bookmakers taking note, and it'll be interesting to see that develop after the World Cup. It'll also be interesting to see rugby develop after the World Cup, as you say, and hopefully some of the steps that you mentioned are put into action, and we see some growth for the game. But that is the full-time whistle on today's podcast, we should say. And Martyn, enjoy the game on Saturday. I will as well. John, au revoir. Enjoy France, my friend.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of iGaming Daily, brought to you in conjunction with SBC Summit Latino America, being held at the Seminole Hard Rock Hotel and Casino in Miami on the 31st of October to the 2nd of November. If you want to find out more about some of the subjects raised today, feel free to explore any of the sites in the SBC News Network. Happy reading.